We're talking today about the World Bank Country Economic Memorandum of Mauritius, a report that has been launched recently, but long in the making. We started the work just before, well, a little while before COVID. And then, of course, we had to change quite a lot of things, and took us a lot longer to deliver than anticipated because of all these unforeseen events. Vania already gave an overview over today's agenda. So we're now in the section where I give an overview of the report. I just wanted to mention this is an incredibly, well, I don't want to say incredibly long because I don't want to deter anyone from reading it, but a very comprehensive report because we wanted to be both strategic, comprehensive, give a bird's eye view, but also kind of drill down on specific recommendations. So it's quite difficult to pack everything in an hour and a half. So what we did is that I'm going to give a small overview now, and then we'll do deep dives on subtopics of individual chapters. But there's a lot more in the report, and while I don't expect many people to want to read the whole thing, I think there's really something for everyone in there. So we actually wrote it up in such a way that you can very quickly dive in on specific topics that you might be interested in. And there are, if you read it electronically, there are actually tools built into the report that allow you to jump directly from one topic to the related recommendations, etc., if that's what you're interested in. So after my overview, we're going to do these 3 deep dives, and then we're going to have a few closing remarks. I assume from Vania, from you, Kevin. And we'll also have, let's say, a word from our sponsor, from our colleagues at IFC, which is the World Bank's private sector arm. And I've asked them to also come in and talk a little bit about not just what we think should be done in Mauritius, but also how we as the World Bank Group through IFC can specifically support the private sector in doing the things you want to do. But let's get straight to the overview. I always want to preface everything we're saying here with saying that we are fully aware of what an impressive success story Mauritius is in Africa, or more broadly in the world, and that by no means we mean to belittle in any way the development success that this country has had in the past. In fact, many of us who work here, who come here, are always impressed with how much there is to learn here, really, for us as development practitioners. Of course, unfortunately, economists or other development practitioners are a little bit like doctors. We're not paid to tell you what is going well, or to say the easy things. We are paid to put our finger where it hurts and point out where we see problems, challenges, etc., and potential solutions. And in the case of Mauritius, we really think that we have by now moved to a level where we're talking about second or perhaps even third generation reforms, which are not really about correcting fundamental flaws, but more fine-tuning and better aligning a series of generally well-functioning institutions and policies to achieve more and more complex policy goals, as is normal when you become a high-income economy. Probably also don't have to remind anyone here what a bad year 2020 has been for Mauritius. We have some of the numbers on the impact of the corona pandemic in the report. Of course, some of this is already dated as we speak, as the situation continues to evolve. But of course, a very severe impact on GDP, on investment, on the tourism and some of the export-oriented sectors in particular. We had a very extensive government intervention, which on one hand prevented some of the worst things to happen on the social and economic front, but of course, on the other hand, has further added to the fiscal deficit and the debt stock. And then the Wakashio accident and the EU blacklisting just kind of topped that off to make it a truly memorably bad year. I think someone said, all we're missing now is a volcano outbreak, and then that's hopefully that's not going to happen. But to get a bit more into the substance of the report, I think the key argument that we're making is that even before the COVID crisis, Mauritius had already been affected by a number of structural challenges, and that just trying to sit out the crisis, make sure everyone survives, and then continue business as usual is probably not going to yield a very solid and inclusive recovery. And these four challenges, I mean, you can summarize them in different ways. They're all interrelated, but you know, the way we put it is, if I go kind of clockwise here, I'm starting with the upper left. You have a lower level of investment than we had just a few years ago, and we also see that a lot of this investment goes into real estate and other activities that are perfectly fine, but that are probably not creating necessarily the productive capacity that would fuel growth going forward. Moving to the upper right, you see a continuous decrease in market share, both for services and goods, reflecting a declining competitiveness, which is affecting most of the traditional export sectors. And then, continuing clockwise, so then we have a rising public debt to GDP trajectory. Again, this is pre-COVID. So a situation where continuously the public sector spends more than it takes in, but where this additional spending doesn't translate into sufficient growth to keep the balance between debt and GDP at least constant. And then lastly, the slide on the bottom left is really just one aspect of the many difficulties we see in the labor market. Rising inequality in labor incomes that have to be offset or are being offset by pretty extensive government involvement, skills mismatch issues, as well as issues of exclusion, in particular when we look at the bottom end of the skills pyramid, where we look at youth and women that are in that skills segment to a very disproportionate extent affected by unemployment. So these are, I think, the key pre-COVID trends that we think need to be addressed if there is to be a sustainable recovery. And the CEM is really our attempt to make a contribution to this discussion. We tried to summarize it all in this graph here, which only when the whole thing was already going to print, someone pointed out to me, looks a bit like a coronavirus. I apologize for that. That was not our intention. But the idea is really to have to propose a reform agenda that is both comprehensive, but also goes into the necessary level of detail to be useful. Of course, we don't think that we can just fly in here for a couple of missions and then write a blueprint on how everything can be fixed. But it's definitely an intention. The intention is to contribute to a dialogue, not to prescribe. But there's a pretty extensive list of suggestions, both in terms of short and medium-term measures, including some that could already be undertaken under the current budget. Let's start with the first chapter, the first challenge, which, as you will recall, was the relatively low level of private investment, and also that private investment not necessarily going into the most productive, most innovative new activities. So in thinking about what can be done to unlock more private investment, I think it's useful to note that Mauritius has traditionally always been a developmental state. There has always been this strong hand-in-hand approach between public and private sector, and I think it's undeniable that it has served the country fairly well in the past. But if we look around what usually happens, around this level of development where Mauritius is now, and also at how the global economy has evolved, how research on these things has evolved, we think that the hallmark of a successful industrial policy has changed a little bit, in the sense that it's increasingly not about directive support, where government and private sector agree on what needs to be done, and then you put certain types of incentives or a joint strategy, and everyone runs off in the same direction, and government kind of helps decide or decides on it, drives the decision on what these sectors should be. And we think that this model needs to move more and more to a model of individual firms or sectors jointly identifying what they want to do, and government's role becoming a little bit less of a driver role and more of a supportive role. Of course, this also implies for the private sector to take on a much stronger and much more decisive role in the process. COVID then, of course, rather unexpectedly brought government intervention in the economy to unprecedented heights. We estimated that just by adding up the biggest of the COVID response programs, we landed roughly 32% of GDP, which would make Mauritius the, I believe, fourth largest country in the world in terms of the relative size of its COVID response package. So then, of course, the question becomes, what do you make out of this? If government is stepping up and doing so much in the economy, which I'm not saying it shouldn't have done, this was an unprecedented shock, but then it becomes even more important to think about what role we would like to see for the public sector in managing the economy. Our recommendations are organized around these blue petals that you see here on the side. So we think that there needs to be more of a focus on some of the horizontal constraints that have emerged, including the management of natural resources, support for innovation, opening up more space for public-private partnerships. We think that quite a lot has to be done on promoting more competition, closing the skills gap, and we also recommend a reform or redirection of how state support is being provided. So today we're going to focus on just 3 of these aspects. The first one is on the skills gap, and the second one is on the redirection of state support, and that links directly to innovation, because that's kind of where the state support, in our opinion, should be redirected towards, so to speak. So for the first segment on closing the skills gap, I would now ask my colleague Vania to briefly speak about training and education. And then my colleague Soonhwa will also briefly speak about migration policy.
Yes, my name is Vania Salgado. I'm an education economist working as consultant in this team. I'm happy to see some familiar faces. So on the closing the skills gap, the key findings are that employers perceive that education and training institutions do not prepare workers with the right skills, that programs are not aligned with the industry needs, and that the quality of training is insufficient. Not new for you. Some of the reasons is that there is a limited support from the education and training institutions to transition to the world of work. Also, because the education and training institutions and the private sector are not effectively working together, as shown in this graph. There are no enough job placements or support to find a job for students, and the curriculum is not delivered by the industry, by you. So a third main reason is that it is particularly rare trainings on digital skills and socio-emotional skills, which are very useful for the work. And ultimately, you, the private sector, advocated in our study for a greater focus on a workforce with middle skills, technical skills. So we know that you have a national skills development strategy in place. We just found that there may be an absence of leadership and coordination among all stakeholders involved. There are no clear leader to ensure the strategic direction of this strategy and to drive the changes needed in the skills reform. In addition, some efforts may need to be done for the continuous involvement of the private sector beyond just consultation processes. So, two important points very quickly on the previous, thank you, Eric, is that the TVET reform is expected as part of the education reform, but, and some activities are under the way, but a cohesive plan still needs to be developed, and the TVET programs need to be reviewed with your help. And finally, that the National Training Fund needs to be much more accessible, especially for small employers. Now, next slide, Eric, thank you. So we came up with a few recommendations to address these issues identified. The first one can be done in the short term and only requires moderate costs. It is about a strong institutional champion, identifying it, to drive the skills reform, bring the vision and leadership needed, and coordinate all stakeholders. So it is not really about creating a new agency, but it's more about bringing the development skills at the highest political level, bringing a whole government approach to work together and identifying this champion and the necessary funding. So we think that you need to decide together what's the best coordination structure and who can be this champion. Some ideas include empowering HRDC if it can report directly to the Prime Minister office, or some other skills structure used in different countries like Singapore or Norway. But definitely we suggest more closer collaboration with Ministry of Finance and EDB, and especially the participation of the private sector. Next slide, please. So after that big first step, other key recommendations are these ones. I just want to briefly mention those that particularly relate to you, to the private sector. The first one is a forward-looking and demand-driven approach, in the National Skills Development Strategy, which means, among other things, the more continuous engagement of the private sector with HRDC. Also improving the quality of education and training institutions, really focus on the partnerships between education and training institutions and the private sector to align the training to the labor market needs. And then the reforms of the TVET, that means partnership more with the private sector, and the reform of the National Training Fund to make it more effective. And finally, the cost effectiveness evaluation of all the skills and employability programs.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about labor migration in Mauritius that plays an important role to fill the skills gaps. So, as in many other countries, as you know, that the firms, the Mauritius firms, can hire foreign skills through two different labor mobility systems that the government put in place. So the first system is the work permit system, which allows the firms to hire semi or low skilled workers from other countries. That is primarily responding to labor needs in the textile and construction industries. These are the jobs locals do not really take up, so they are essentially the enablers for this lower segment of the labor needs in this type of industries. And the second one is the occupation permit system that allows firms to hire more skilled workforce from abroad. And these are really responding to the gaps in more high-skilled labor in Mauritius, primarily in the IT related and also financial services. So it's largely on the services sector that requires this more knowledge-based, which is more knowledge-based economy. So how to differentiate the two systems is really determined by the monthly wages the foreign worker is supposed to earn, and if a worker earns less than 30,000 rupees, it would be subject to work permit, and if it is more than 60,000 rupees, it would be subject to occupation permit. Of course, I make here note that in the IT sector, the occupation permit gives an exception for the monthly earning of 30,000 rupees. And additionally, the firms have now opportunities to hire international students in Mauritius. So while they are studying, it will be under work permit. Once they graduate, it's occupation permit that was stipulated in the recent budget speech. This is a very important progress, especially these graduates could lead into important innovations. Generally, the migration literature suggests that the foreign labor, foreign talents contribute to raise productivity and innovation in the receiving countries. They also create jobs for natives by enabling the easing certain labor bottlenecks, and also help natives to specialize tasks. So there is a very broad consensus finding here. And in Mauritius, there are certain bottlenecks to harness this type of benefits. First of all, maybe I'll mention about what's happening in the work permit system, and it's the work permit system. The process for the firms to obtain a work permit is rather cumbersome and complicated, so it takes quite a bit of time that it increases operation cost. And the second is how are we going to address skills that are falling in between 30,000 and 60,000 rupees earning per month, of course, except IT sector, as I mentioned earlier. And and also in the tourism and the medical sector, as you may know, that it's not open to everybody, but they have this specific occupation shortage list that are open, of which occupations are open to foreign labor, but these need to be updated in collaboration with the sector participants. As to the occupation permit, so could we consider that the duration of the occupation permit be beyond 10 years as seen in other countries? So it's 10 years, the validity over 10 years was stipulated in the recent budget speech. And could we also look into creating a pathway for these professionals to citizenships as done in other countries, like for instance in Singapore, that rely on foreign skills quite heavily. And then finally, as you know, there's more and more Mauritius companies are becoming multinational. So maybe it's a time also to think about creating a system to facilitate the movement of professionals within these multinational firms across borders to facilitate knowledge exchanges, maybe beyond the normal 1 year or 2 years. So these essentially, these challenges would become a bottleneck to prosper innovation and expansion of business in the Mauritius owing to skill shortages, and could also deter foreign direct investment. And what to do next, slide, Eric. What to do is, of course, the work permit is under Ministry of Labor. So maybe I could talk about the work permit first. So as you guessed already from my earlier talk, is that to create a more streamlined work permit system, first of all, so that the whole process could take less time. So one example to eliminate could be is to undertake the step by the Ministry of Labor to match jobs for local from the local job seeker pool, which is already some of them is outdated, and so the reason why is that there is this labor job posting test, so that the firms has to post the jobs for certain periods. So this economic needs test might be sufficient to prove for certain there are labor shortages for given vacancy. And in the work permit system, another thing to consider is to allow these foreign workers to change employers. It's not all the time that they have to do, but they're allowed to do. But it's more like to address certain firms face economic conditions, just like in COVID, when the firms have difficulties. Instead of letting these workers to go back home, other firms in need of this type of skills could be hire these workers, so that reallocation of foreign labor in this space could be more efficient. So it would also reduce hiring cost and operating cost for the firms. So we have seen that happening in other countries like Australia during this COVID time. And as to the occupation permits under EDB, whether it could be considered to develop a certain type of occupation shortage list founded by the labor market analysis, of course, so that who is eligible for occupation permit could be determined based on the occupation shortages, complemented, of course, by the certain income earning cuts. So this would also serve more transparency in the system, and especially for the job applicants' viewpoint. Now, once they see the list of jobs that are available, occupation types are available, that they could look into that type of jobs in the in Mauritius. So that could be another way of promoting job opportunities in Mauritius. So that leads me to my another point on the occupation permit is more about really to promote Mauritius as a destination to foreign talents. So firms say that it's very difficult to fill the foreign talent vacancies. So maybe leverage diaspora networks to advertise Mauritius as a destination. So these reforms could potentially improve efficiency in managing and hiring work permit for foreign workers on the work permit system, as well as this addressing labor shortages in both in firms, so that would hire workers under both work permit system and the occupation permit.
I think chapter 1 at the end of the day is really about laying out horizontal policy priorities that we think would ultimately constitute a more useful approach to industrial policy than trying to incentivize or subsidize particular sectors. And I just want to be very clear that we're not advocating a weak state or a weakened state, but we're advocating for a state that is more supportive than directive in its role vis-a-vis private investment. A lot of the things we're advocating are actually very hard to do, and we are fully cognizant of that. And I think it's also quite important to recognize that industrial policy is as much about doing the right thing as it is about not doing the wrong thing. And nobody knows with certainty and with absolute certainty ex ante what the wrong thing is. So it's quite important to always build in monitoring and evaluation capacity to make sure that what you're spending, what you're doing, actually ends up serving the purpose you intended it to serve. I'm not going to read out this quote here by Eiginger and Roderick for you, but I think it's a pretty nice summary of what an industrial policy paradigm actually should look like. So not so much about top-down policy making, but about creating platforms for dialogue, establishing what needs to be done, and then making sure that the information flows once that is being implemented on how well it's doing. Under such an approach, usually the criteria for state support being used, government stepping up and spending money, is that there is some sort of market failure that needs to be addressed because it would otherwise hold back competitive new industries from emerging. So there's really kind of a built-in focus on innovation and discovery, because those are per se or empirically usually the main market failures we find. It's always risky to be the first one who goes and does something new. And once you've done it, everyone else will do the same thing. So you're very much sharing the benefit, but you keep the risk for yourself. So that's a clear-cut case for government to step in and support. But if we look at what is currently actually being done, and we didn't analyze every single government program, but we looked at some of the bigger ticket items, we see, for example, that there's an annual allowance for investment. But it basically applies to any sort of investment. So it mostly benefits capital-intensive sectors, tourism, manufacturing, retail, and real estate, which are great sectors, but these are not exactly the kind of new emerging sectors in Mauritius. We also see that the direct and indirect subsidies that come straight out of the budget are primarily to the sugar and manufacturing industry. So also more cost support to existing activities than trying to incentivize new things to emerge. Then there are a number of tax holidays which are very much targeted to new activities. But I think there are two issues with tax holidays. On one hand, they might be overly targeted. You pick a very specific activity, and then if you do that, you get the tax holiday. And if you don't get it. instead of just saying, okay, innovation per se is being supported. And the other problem with tax holidays is that based on the global empirical evidence, they're just a terrible policy instrument, because if you grant a tax holiday, it's very attractive to a firm that is already profitable. And it's not that attractive, or not at all attractive, to a firm that doesn't anticipate making profits early on. So you're basically incentivizing those the most that need it the least, and vice versa. So the track record of this particular instrument of state support is actually very, very poor. And it only sometimes makes sense if you're in a very, very bad policy environment or institutional environment where the tax authorities are so corrupt that investors don't even want to talk to them, basically. So they prefer this full exemption. But in the Mauritian context, we think that tax holidays should be avoided as an instrument. And then finally, there is an R&D tax credit, and I think only a handful of firms have ever used that because it is so complex. And as I already discussed before, COVID-19 and the various measures put in place in response to COVID that were put into place again and for good reasons have really put state support on steroids, made the whole thing just that much bigger. And of course, the MIC just volume-wise stands out, and also in the sense that it's not just a short-term crisis response, but also has a forward-looking mandate to support innovation. So I've given you a little bit an overview of what we think one might consider doing a little bit less of in a kind of more modern industrial policy paradigm. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Gabriel, who led the review of the innovation system in Mauritius, to talk a little bit about what one might instead do more of. Gabriel?
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I must say, when we did this report, we benefited a lot from the insights of the Business Mauritius. We had a very long discussion, I remember, over the phone with Kevin, who I have to say I was impressed that, for somebody coming from the business sector, I mean, I know that that you're on the board of MRIC, but the deep knowledge of these innovation instruments and issues was, definitely very useful for me, and we learned a lot from other stakeholders that we met while we were there. So I will just kind of give, some messages on three areas. I think the first is on the building blocks that are there. The second is on changes that I see as positive from recent times. And then the last is these areas for opportunities in the innovation and science space. So I think in terms of building blocks, what's really interesting, looking at Mauritius is that a lot of the, different things that we look in an entrepreneurial ecosystem, in an innovation ecosystem, are already there. The business environment, quite attractive for international entrepreneurs, the professional services and financial sector diversification, the availability of certain types of incubators, accelerators, these kind of instruments, connectivity, which is extremely important, particularly in a smaller market, and then the existence of a number of agencies, some of which are already quite aligned and have restructured recently to meet best practices. In terms of positive changes, I think it's important to highlight that the changes in the instruments have led to changes in IPR allocation, which I think should improve the incentives for companies to want to participate in things like the CRIGS, the collaborative research schemes of the MRIC, the new IP law, the R&D tax deductions, which, as Erik said, it's an instrument that has been widely used in Europe, in Israel, in the US, in many countries, but it tends to be quite useful for large companies. There's usually very small uptake of R&D incentives in the smaller companies, and especially in the new, younger companies that you probably want to see in Mauritius, because the type of instrument requires certain types of financial indicators of performance. We could discuss that further later on. I think another positive change that I learned about while I was there was on the types of centers of excellence, let's call them, that are kind of consolidating now, whether it's the FinTech Hub in the ALU, the Center for Biomedical Research, the Agritech center incubator. So I think these are really kind of good examples of how to go into more applied type of space on science and innovation, which in the context of a relatively thin kind of high-tech industry, and also, which limits demand for this kind of products. And also that the University of Mauritius and other institutions there are still trying to achieve, global standards of excellence. I think these kind of pockets can really make a difference in terms of benefits to the economy. What are the areas of opportunities that we saw? I think partly, and the message we tried to give in the CEM, in this report, was that sometimes less is more. That often we saw that if an instrument wasn't working very well, a new one would be put in place to try and address that problem, and then another one and another one. And what that led is also a question of uncertainty, fragmentation, and then for the companies, startups, entrepreneurs that wanted to access them, not knowing which are the high quality ones, what kind of results we could get from that. And sometimes the size of instruments tended to be quite small. I would say that was particularly the case more in the science side, where the science funding seems to be dispersing a lot of resources across a lot of different groups. And I think more could be done there to tie it to local economy needs, strengthen excellence. I mean, we make this point here that outputs on the Global Innovation Index and other indicators are not as strong as inputs. And you can see it clearly in science, increasing trend in terms of number of scientists per capita. But when you look at the impact metrics that we use in science, like citations, number of people that are looking at this research, it hasn't really increased to the same extent. So I think there's a question of really doing more with the same amount of resources by changing some of the instruments that are in place. Second area I would say is on the talent pipeline. And that's kind of been well covered in the last presentation, but I think clearly to attract foreign investment, to create innovation labs, that's a critical element. And I mean, it cannot be done just by training of the local population. This question of international collaboration, international workforce, particularly now in this post-COVID sort of world, is going to be very important. A third is really the capacity of the agencies and using monitoring and evaluation. And I have to say, when we did this report, we didn't have access to a lot of information on the results of the programs of MRIC. And now when I look at the website, I see there's a lot more there. So obviously this is something that takes time, and some of these programs are new. I think a lot more could still be done in terms of understanding what is there on the landscape of private innovation. And just as an advertisement, we've been doing work with the NPCC productivity study, which should be coming out shortly. And so that has a lot of fresh information about innovation in the private sector. And then lastly, just to finish, I think this brand recognition, Mauritius has a tremendous brand recognition. I mean, I lived in South Africa for 3 years, and Mauritius was always a kind of a reference point in terms of business environment and different, finance, the global finance. I think innovation is one of those next frontiers in terms of brand recognition. And it's not so easy to get to the leaderboard of the Global Innovation Index, because only larger economies like China have managed to get sort of in a short period of time to the top places. So I don't know if that's the aspiration, but I think things like, I know that this week was the launch of kind of a Mauritian satellite into orbit from the International Space Station. I mean, those kind of Sputnik moments that kind of signal to the rest of the world are important, even if the applications are limited. And then I think these programs, like showing the results of those programs, making them open to other universities, to other companies, trying to bring some larger investors to showcase that there is this interest to come to the country from the corporate side, I think is also really, really important to demonstrate the potential there.
There are a number of opportunities for upgrading. There are some kind of nascent new things, and there are also a lot of opportunities in the region, but none of this so far has reached a scale to compensate for this consistent decline in the traditional sectors. And that, I think, is very clearly illustrated by the slide here below. So if I can ask you for a minute to not focus on the text, but focus on the graph. You see in blue exports in 2010 to 2014. This is only merchandise, not services. And you see in red the same exports in 2015, 2019. And then the distinction on the horizontal axis is precisely in complexity. So in a nutshell, how sophisticated is the product? And you see that most of the decline has really taken place in product groups 1 and 2. So by far the least sophisticated one is, the least sophisticated ones. And then in the third and fourth decile, the fourth one, you even see a little bit of an increase. And I wouldn't make too much out of what comes in 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think this is the data there is a little bit contaminated by re-exports as well. But the crucial part here is a lot of the old stuff is already disappearing and the new stuff is not happening fast enough to make up for it. We can even trace that back to the product level. So here we're plotting, I believe, the 100 biggest export products at HS 6-digit level. So this is kind of very detailed trade data, very narrowly defined products. And you see this big bulk of products here in the bottom left-hand quarter. So products with low complexity and where the level of exports has actually decreased over the last 5 years. And you see a pretty clear correlation that for the more complex products, in some cases, exports have grown quite substantially, or at least they have declined less. But all these dots still remain fairly small. So this is not happening at a pace fast enough to make up for what's happening on the bottom left corner. I'm going to come back to this slide in a moment when we start our Q&A, but let me just jump into some of the things that we recommend that could be done about it. And again, we talk about a lot of other stuff as well. We talk about FDI, we talk about the exchange rate, etc. But I wanted to quickly mention the analysis we did on the new regional trade agreements with India, with China, as well as the African Continental Free Trade Area, because we think that these can really be a springboard for Mauritius to substantially upgrade into more sophisticated new exports with a little help from preferences thanks to these trade agreements. And the analysis we did is summarized in the annex of the CEM. You have all these tables there. So we looked at the entire universe of tradable products. Again, unfortunately, this is only merchandise for now. And we looked at products that are imported on a large scale by China, India, and countries in Africa, and that are currently imported under non-zero tariffs. So you see, for example, this first one here, whatever cyclic amides are, excuse my ignorance, are currently imported by China on a pretty large scale, and they carry an MFN tariff of 6.5%, and they come from Norway, Italy, and Japan. Mauritius could export them duty-free to China. We're currently not yet exporting them. A lot of these products that we find here are already being exported, but it would fall into the 76th percentile of complexity for Mauritius. So it would represent a significant upgrade in export sophistication. And I'm sure there are a couple of blinds in here, products. This is not a sophisticated product by product analysis. It's a high level data analysis. So not all of this makes sense. But it's a list of, I believe, 100 products per country that we're now working with EDB to kind of operationalize and make sure that companies in Mauritius are aware of these opportunities. And of course, this could also be used as an investment attraction tool for companies who are currently exporting this from Norway, Italy, or Japan, for EDB to approach them and say, would you potentially be interested in doing this from Mauritius? We're now doing a very similar exercise with EDB to cover services as well. And that information will then also become available through their website. So the key recommendation on that is basically to use this type of information in the way I just described it, make sure that firms here are aware of these opportunities and help them proactively to exploit these opportunities.
I'll just add a little bit to what Erik has already mentioned, and I think a lot of relevant discussion has already happened even under the first section when we were discussing skills, immigration, etc. But very quickly, just to build on what Erik was saying, we looked at the Mauritian economy from a complexity perspective, noting that there is a direct correlation between complexity and, of course, and GDP and growth, and noted overall that the complexity score for Mauritius is really low, and looking at the existing product lines, particularly in the textile and garment sector, agribusiness, etc., the diversity in the export basket is just really low and doesn't include very many products that are, for lack of a better word, unique or difficult to manufacture or complex in their production activity. So something that I noted that Arif mentioned earlier in the first section was, that there is opportunity for current products where we have current exports where complexity can be increased, and Erik made that point again. So we know in textile and garment sector, for example, the sector has stagnated in the apparel manufacturing where it hasn't really invested and innovated and built further on it. So just one example is medical textiles, and a question that I have that we never really got a chance to explore as part of our study is that with COVID, what were the constraints that Mauritius had in actually trying to capture the opportunity to, for example, go into PPE manufacturing, whether it was textile-based or advanced respirators, etc., which build a lot on the knowledge of the textile sector. So there are things and gaps there. But what we looked at broadly then was, what are the different ways in which Mauritius can improve its complexity? And you can do that by improving and diversifying into new products in a country, right? So whether it's a complex or even if it's not complex, you can just improve the number of products in your export basket. That's one approach. The other way is to enter new markets and new value chains. And the third way is to sort of integrate more technology and new processes. So using this as an overarching framework, we looked at about 4 pathways for Mauritius, which was about improving competitiveness and diversifying in light manufacturing. I won't go into the challenges of that. Erik has already mentioned what those obvious issues are. The other option is obviously to go into advanced and niche manufacturing. Here we're talking about things that don't depend on volume and scale and low skill labor. Or even if they do, the volume of margin is significant, that you're not dependent on large volumes, right? So you have something like specialized jewelry or even some medical equipment that can be in that category. Or you go into more complex manufacturing, but that's, we're talking about pharmaceuticals now, which requires a more broader ecosystem that needs to be around it. The third strategy is to go regional. We're talking about the markets that Erik was mentioning earlier. The markets that we know are closed and offer us some opportunity are within the region. And we looked at a similar analysis that Erik just mentioned in reference to the free trade agreements with China and India, and realized that there were products being imported in the COMESA and the SADC region, which Mauritius could easily tap into. It was very well qualified and capable of tapping into, but it's the lack of proper logistics and connectivity that makes it difficult. And sometimes it's just about knowledge and awareness, and in some cases some policies as well. The final thing was, should Mauritius just sort of abandon light manufacturing altogether and instead become more of a model where it's a service-oriented, headquarter-based or island where companies come and build their hubs here, but deliver services from there in terms of financing, in terms of manufacturing related services out of Mauritius. So Mauritius focuses more on innovation and R&D and things like that. These are all ways that Mauritius can improve complexity. The question is which path Mauritius wants to go down. And then I think that's the energy was around the go regional model. And so we've tried to cultivate a framework for that and some of the policy recommendations, many of which have been already discussed. So I won't go into that. I'll mention one last thing, that no matter what, I think Mauritius will benefit significantly in building a brand for itself around sustainability. I think this is where the future is. This is where the opportunity is. I think anything you think about and look at has to be from that lens. And I use sustainability in very broad terms. This includes power, it includes water, it includes waste collection, it includes, the skill sets, it includes even the infrastructure side, whether it's the special economic zones or industrial parks, etc.
Let me just make just a very few points, and it relates to the role that trade policy can play in helping Mauritius diversify and complexify. its services economy. The economy took a major hit, of course, because of COVID, like many island economies. And I guess one challenge looking ahead is what scope exists to reduce the contribution of the tourism sector to the economy, what scope exists to diversify the tourism offer, and what are the sectors and services that offer prospects for gains in competitiveness. And I think if you look at, of course, the geography of Mauritius, God was clearly in a good mood when Mauritius was created, gave it such phenomenal geographical endowments, but it didn't give it great location. It's not easy. And as you said, Erik, the easiest way to overcome the tyranny of geography, probably in today's world economy, is to go digital and to harness the scope that exists to grow a digital offer, both domestically and for foreign exports. And there has been quite significant progress in Mauritius in creating an ecosystem for ICT services, but it has not translated yet into a very significant gain in exports. So I think this is really an area in which efforts have to be redoubled to incentivize and grow the exportability of ICT services. And post-COVID, that's going to be a very important challenge, and it's a challenge that cuts across many sectors beyond tourism. The other element that I think is worth noting is that Mauritius is quite unique in having FTAs with China, the US, the possibility of going deep with the EU, and if it wants to play strategic, perhaps also approach the United States for an FTA. Given the Biden administration's desire to sort of counter China's growing influence, Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. So if it does pursue its path of FTA-driven export diversification, I think there's a lot of scope for improving performance in services. And that's going to be an important choice that the country faces in the coming years. But negotiating is one thing, deriving concrete benefits for business is another. And I think here, with both the FTAs with China and India, difficult countries to compete with, both are hugely important service exporting firms, highly competitive. China, more than India, actually exports 30% more services than India does. But the idea is, how can we attract FDI and skills from both countries and establish Mauritius as a beachhead for accessing the CFTA market, the African market. And there's a very important carte à jouer, if you want. Mauritius does not have a lot of leverage vis-a-vis Africa because its services regime is much more open than most of its partners on the continent. So Mauritius, its trade policy really has to play a leadership role in opening the markets in Africa in services. And that negotiation is still proceeding, both in services generally and in digital. So here, leadership by Mauritius in opening African markets will actually allow it to put in place its strategy of being a beachhead for countries interested in servicing the African market from a much more stable regulatory ecosystem. And finally, I would say, perhaps in contrast to Gabriel, something I heard repeatedly when I came to Mauritius for the mission, for the report, was a concern that the branding of Mauritius' services offering was not so distinct, not so clear. You could say, what is Mauritius's jingle? We know the Indian jingle, we know the Malaysian jingle, we know a lot of countries are extremely good at branding their services offerings, not only in tourism, but beyond. And again, I think it's an important challenge for Mauritius in very tough post-COVID recovery times to just perhaps exist a bit more through better branding and marketing alongside efforts to boost the competitiveness of export-oriented service firms.
talk about a number of aspects of inclusiveness, but we're going to zoom in on two of these petals again. The first one being on labor market participation, the other one on social protection efficiency.
I want just to mention a couple of things. First, an overview of why improving inclusiveness is important, and then perhaps discuss one specific policy that concerns working women. So there are basically, or at least I think about promoting inclusiveness or shared prosperity, how we call it at the bank, in two ways. One is to make growth more inclusive, meaning that make sure that as many individuals as possible participate in the labor market, contribute to the economy, and benefit from it. The second option is that I just focus on economic growth first, and then I redistribute at the end, ex post, which means I just try to make the pie as big as possible, and then I'll try to make my best to redistribute to those that have been left behind. Of course, there is no perfect balance. It's just a political or social preference, the combination or the striking a balance between these two. And each combination has, of course, social, economic, and fiscal implications. We believe that in a context of an aging population, a shrinking labor force, and now even more a limited fiscal space, improving inclusive growth, so working ex ante, is preferable rather than insisting on redistributing ex post. So that's why we put the accent on support labor market participation. I will not just talk about all these numbers, also because they are outdated. They refers to before the pandemic, and the pandemic has just made everything worse, but a couple of items. So labor market participation, meaning people that work or look for a job, are quite low among households that are poor or households that fall in the bottom 40% of the income distribution. And when we look at the demographics, is mostly these groups are mostly composed of young people and women with little education. So perhaps I'll just I mean, there are many issues, many ways to, many policies, many aspects to take into account in order to improve labor market participation. But let's just talk about one that is probably the most interesting for business Mauritius. So today, an employed woman is entitled to 14 weeks of maternity, paid maternity leave, which is equal to the ILO minimum standard, on full pay, which is above the ILO standard, which suggests 2/3 of pay, plus a maternity leave allowance of about 3,000 rupees if the worker has been with the same employer for at least 2 consecutive months. Fathers have a paternity leave of 5 days. There is no such thing as parental leave. And employers are individually liable for the cost of maternity leave benefits. So this proposal, this suggestion is about trying to transit from an employer liability system to a social insurance system where responsibility for payment of maternity leave benefits becomes shared among employers, among workers, and possibly with some contribution from the government. This is simply, or perhaps not simply, but this is one of the way to try to promote employment of women in the private sector, because when an employer is fully liable to pay for maternity leave, then perhaps there is some bias against women. And we skipped the previous slide, but that slide shows that job vacancies that are posted at the employment information centers, these are mostly low-skilled works, first allow employers to express a preference, which is not such a good thing. And second, you see that the blue bar, which is the job vacancies with a preference for men, is overwhelmingly is larger than the red, or I guess purple red bar that is an express preference for women. So basically, the idea is to transition from an employer a system with an individual employer liability to a social insurance program on top of many other things. We have done a costing exercise. There is a typo. It's not the cost of parental leave, but maternity leave. It probably comes with it's probably not perfectly right, also because it's based on survey data rather than administrative data with the exact salary of each working woman. But the idea is basically to centrally collect and disburse benefits while leaving the reform fiscally neutral.
Good afternoon, everyone. As I'm sure you know, social protection in Mauritius is quite widespread, and it has been relatively effective in mitigating poverty, reducing poverty from 15.1% to 9.2% with the variety of programs. But the bulk of social spending, more than 50%, is on the basic retirement pension. And this will become increasingly costly over time as the population continues to age. It has a relatively limited impact on poverty and reducing poverty, and create adverse labor market incentives, encouraging people who could be productive to withdraw from the labor market. An ideal reform to the pension system, which would then open the door to releasing fiscal resources that could be used for more poverty reduction and providing resources for other fiscal priorities, would balance the fiscal sustainability of the pension system with benefit adequacy and bring it in line with international standards. Just to give you 3 quick examples of how it could be brought more in line with international standards. Typically, the idea of a pension is something that's given when work capacity has diminished. And internationally, we see this happening in the last 15 years of life. So what we see, though, in Mauritius is that at a retirement age of 60, or where the basic retirement pension is available, life expectancy is 21 years, which is quite significantly higher than when work capacity diminishes. So raising the retirement age would free up a substantial amount of resources. The second issue is that typically non-contributory benefits globally are capped at a roughly 20% of average wage, not the 50% that Mauritius now faces. So again, capping them, gradually bringing the level down to 20% of average wage would again save resources. The third would be to institute or reinstitute a contributory system to reach the ILO goal that for those who have worked 30 years, they should end up with a pension of 40%. If they're already getting 20% of average wage from the basic retirement pension, they would need a little bit less from the only 20% from the contributory pension on average to get to this goal of 40%. So we think that it would be very important to both bring in this contributory element where people who contribute get something for those contributions, as well as to limit the universal benefit as it is globally, and to raise the retirement age. The combination of all of these will free up enough fiscal resources that they can be used on other social protection programs as well as other governmental priorities.